Erev Tov, everyone.
Hello.
Where's the audio on this?
Hey. Hey, good to be with you all.
You can thank Martha Hare, who put out a second announcement.
I was very grateful. We always need those reminders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Nice. Good. More people joining. Hey, Haley. Hey, Chito. Glad to see you both. Yay. You've got the focus thing, so I can only see.
Yeah, we're gonna pick chat. Hi, Rabbi.
No worries. Okay.
No, it's where it was.
No worries. Right. We may pick up a few people after Cheryl's davening, which I don't know if any of you were on, but I assume it hasn't ended yet. I didn't want to conflict.
Probably just ending, right? Yeah.
But yes, exactly.
Tonight,
for those who don't know, our most amazing davener volunteer, Cheryl Hurwitz, leads Tuesday nights at 7, a very thoughtful, musical, meditative, amazing davening, which hopefully you'll all avail yourselves of at some point. So, all right. Okay. All right. Glad to see so many. Can I ask, is there a volunteer or two who I could make co-host just to be able to admit people? Or anyone good at that? Sarah, thank you. Way to jump in. Your first official volunteer role. Thank you. Okay, so unless they sound like a terrorist or white supremacist nationalist, let them in. We're pretty easy.
Now that wasn't fully informed consent before I volunteered.
I gotta get onto this other thing now, so
Fair
I'm sorry, but I have to cut.
Okay. Cool. All right. Awesome. Thank you. All right. It is wonderful to see us. We are a nice group already, and we are not going to rehash what we did last time. However, the link is already out there to the previous session where we focused more on Moosar as this wonderful set of teachings and practices for its sort of conceptual application to today's climate crisis and other environmental challenges. So you can come at this more from the green side or more from the Moosar side, or you could be green at both, and that is okay. We are here to grow, another sort of greenery theme. I wonder if anyone who was here the previous session or perhaps wasn't would be comfortable opening with just your own sense of what is Moosar. There are as many definitions as there are people, so there's no wrong answer.
Okay, so I'll go ahead. So my understanding of Moosar, but I haven't really looked at the literature for a few years now, but is that it's really about cultivating and maybe strengthening muscles in different character traits, which are known as Midot, but I can't even remember the exact number, something approximating 12 maybe, but it's some nice symbolic number. And all of us have strengths and deficits. And so there's always going to be something that we read and that, as we reflect on how well we exercise any particular character trait, how well we're doing it, and are there things we can do to improve it. The thing that I find interesting in Moosar is that in many ways, the originators of Moosar were kind of extreme. But the most recent literature, so there's much more about like self-flagellation and but the latter day interpreters of Moosar that most of us are familiar with and the Muslims consult have a much more benign approach and really see this as a way of empowering ourselves and being better people and just having something to reflect upon. It's like I think of it as something that gives you an anchor to consider your own behavior and how much you may or may not be changing, through sort of intentional awareness. So that's my lay version.
Beautiful. For those just arriving, we were getting a little background on what is Moosar before we jump into the slides, which will each have texts and images and midot. And Deborah, right off the bat, introduced the notion of midot, or attributes, and that we work on a list of them. The traditional list, in fact, is a baker's dozen. So you said 12, it's 13, but we throw in the 13th for free. That's just how we roll. So absolutely, and of course, there's many more than 13 attributes we can be working on. The number 13 attributes is not incidental. It comes up in the Torah in just 2 weeks when we're standing at Sinai after the golden calf, and Moses asks to see God's face, God's essence, and God says, I can't, right? No one can see my face and die, but I will show you my essence, and out comes the 13 attributes. Adonai, Adonai El Rachum V'Chanun, right? As we learned last time, in a most remarkable twist, the 13 attributes as such, it's just Exodus chapter 34. And in the 18th century, everyone in the educated West knew that text and knew those attributes, including a young up-and-comer from Philadelphia who wrote an autobiography and talked about the idea of creating a system of 13 attributes to work on over time, maybe one a week. And that sounded like such a good idea from the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, that when Menachem Mendel of Santanov read it over in Europe a generation later, he then wrote in 1808 a Franklin inflected version of this using Torah imagery that then Rav Salanter, Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the modern Mussar movement in the mid-19th century, expanded on, and here we are. So we actually have the Exodus 34 and Benjamin Franklin to thank for our current practice. Fun fact. That is one of many goodies that we touched on in the last session, and we are not going to go over this time. Deborah opened with a beautiful overview. Does anyone want to add anything about what is Moosar? Okay. The only thing that I would add is, and that was a great overview, is that in more traditional circles, Moosar is just another approach for Torah. It is ultimately about how to live a holy life. And so when you study it in its original sources, they say this is not a self-help curriculum, right? This does not belong in the power of positive thinking or self-help or new age, sections at Politics and Prose. But in liberal settings, actually it can be. Because if we understand the holy and the good as roughly parallel, and we're not going to, as traditional religionists of all stripes will do, and say just because it's in my scripture according to normative understanding, it must be absolutely true. But since our understanding of Torah is also affected by modern philosophy, by feminist thought, by postmodernism, by community, and hearing each other's experiences, and all of that goes into our ethical Torah hopper, then for us, the holy and the good can be roughly synonymous. That's an oversimplification, but important. And therefore, we are working on ourselves in order to make ourselves better, in order to make the world better. And that process, tikkuning the olam, is, of course, another name for the spiritual journey, or Jewish engagement, or all the other things that we as Adat Shalom stand for. Okay, so Moosar is, again, something that was incredibly central for much of the last 1,000 years of Judaism, and particularly the 100 or so years from, say, 1840 to 1940. And I use that number advisedly because the vast majority of the great lights of Moosar were, of course, killed in the Shoah. And the survivors emerged and rebuilt Moosar in Jerusalem and New York, a little bit in London. But it took another generation for the insights to sort of dribble out into the non-yeshiva community. And it's really been amazing that as recently as 25 years ago, when I finished rabbinic school, Moosar was not part of the curriculum. And now it is front and center in Jewish engagement, rightly so. And I think more and more every decade, and in our case, probably more and more every year, because there's definitely some growing excitement. And I see some of you, to my knowledge, may be new to this, but some of you are already engaged with some of the amazing offerings, a few of which have been through Adat Shalom, but more through some of the great NGOs that are out there, for which we will see the slide in just a moment. Any questions or thoughts before we begin tonight's journey, which is focused on the Midot themselves? Going once, twice. All right. So, oops, let's start at the beginning. Always nice to sing. Here's 4 Midot for you. Ahava v'rachamim chesed v'shalom. Ahava v'rachamim chesed v'shalom. So Moosar, as this larger approach of Jewish life and practice, and specifically midot, or attributes. We're going to focus there. I'm only recycling a few of the slides from last time to remind us that there is a world out there. So in the middle is Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer, who has taught Moosar at Adat Shalom and brought it in many ways to the Reconstructionist world, because she was an early student of Rabbi Ira Stone, the gentleman in the bow tie in the middle, from Philadelphia, conservative rabbi, who's an incredible leader in this field, and who founded the Center for Contemporary Moosar. And if you saw the listserv announcement that Martha Hare, one of our own, has been studying through Center for Contemporary Moosar and was just graduated as one of their official teachers, which is really no small thing. Yay, Martha, and she's with us in absentia, and we'll be watching the recording, so hey, Martha. So Ira is one of the great lights. On the left, Alan Marinis, who helped to establish the Moosar Institute, which is perhaps the largest and most accessible of these. And on the right, a personal friend and teacher, Rabbi David Jaffe, who shares a lot of bio with me, kind of progressive organizer of the same generation, went and got Orthodox smicha and studied in both Hasidic and Moosar yeshivot, but is still applying it in this way. And his book on the lower left, Changing the World from the Inside Out, is the closest thing that already exists to what we're teaching tonight, and very influential for me, along with all these other wonderful resources. Bottom line, if you're new to this, I hope this excites you and you choose to do more. If you're not new to this, I hope you're still on the journey and choose to do more. And there will be many more opportunities. The founder, Rav Salanter, said this famous quote, "The Torah came to create a mensch," right? Like essentially this is a parallel for Torah. And what we talked about last time was really starting in the more obscure direction of what are the frameworks of Musar. And so I'm not going to teach tonight about Nikudota Bechira, choice points, or about Hitlamdut, a stance of always being open to learning. Not even, for the most part, about Noseh Ba'ol, of bearing the burden of the other, nor Cheshbon HaNefesh, self-accounting, nor the Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara. It's all good stuff. Go see the recording, or keep studying Mussar and you'll figure it all out on your own. Tonight, we are zeroing in on the Midot. What are the Midot? The attributes. But what does Midah literally mean? Anyone? I can only see a few, so unmute if you know the literal translation of Midot. Midah singular, Midot plural.
Character trait.
That is the applied definition. Yes. So just like when I ask B mitzvah students, what is mitzvah? And I say, I used to say, they don't know this anymore. There's a Jeopardy answer that's technical and there's a Family Feud answer that's popular, right? So the Family Feud answer to mitzvah, right, is a good deed. The technical is commandment. The Family Feud answer to what are midot are character attributes. The technical, which is the one that modern Hebrew speakers know. Anyone? It's literally measures. Midah is measure. Midah keneged midah is measure for measure, as in Shakespeare, right? And it's also used in science. So as soon as or in recipes, right? So whether you're like a Hebrew speaker in second grade and you already know midah and midot in this very secular measurement, quantifiable way, that's exactly the point, that it's all about balancing. It's all about finding the right quantity of a particular attribute in a particular moment. And by strengthening these characteristics ahead of time through practice and through accountability with others, through ongoing learning and reflection, we are likelier to be able to bring the right amount at the right time in time. A lot of Mussar is about you work on these things so that first you realize you have a problem, and then you get to the point where you can identify where you sort of were off base, off your midah afterward, and go apologize. And then you get to the point where you realize it just afterwards, and you can apologize in the same conversation. And then you get to the point where you actually begin to realize, I am heading in that direction before you say it or before you do it. And that is ultimately the goal, is to shorten that response time. Here are a bunch of examples that are more or less all traditional, and there's many ways of framing it. Notice I say, see also virtues, because virtues are a secular or philosophical concept in the field of ethics. Ethics and religion overlap, but they don't always completely do so, right? So this is the Virtues Project that our own Dara and Dave Feldman are involved in, which is actually founded by Linda Popov, who was Baha'i and brought Baha'i teachings to create the Virtues Project. And if you look at this list, you see what looks a lot like Mussar. And every one of these we can focus on and harness. Every one of these we could put some Torah around, but you could also put sacred scripture of any faith around. Many of these would also have eco application, which is our theme tonight. This is from the Foundation for a Jewish Camp. It's up at Havaya and elsewhere. It's another way of organizing it on a periodic table. And similarly, the filmmaker Tiffany Schlein has some great videos like Making of a Mensch that are kind of intro to Midot and to Mussar. And this is the list from that initiative. There's a lot of great approaches. So before I go into what I've already culled from my Mussar reflections as especially useful in an era of climate crisis, I would love to hear from you. So for a moment, I'm going to stop the screen share and invite in the chat, whether you know the Hebrew or not, whether it's one of the traditional Midot or not, if you would just name some character traits or attributes that might have some environmental application. We're not going to go into it now. I just want to get our own brains flowing. So awareness, starting with simply looking around. Thank you. That
Generosity. Generosity.
Generosity, hitnadvut, right on. Commitment, which includes the stick-to-itiveness of zirizut, but it goes deeper. Justice, tzedek, absolutely. Balance, izun. Thank you, Linda. Bearing the burden of the other, noseh ba'ol, but also humility, anava. Consideration. There isn't even a great translation for that. Now they're coming fast and furious. Moderation, another form of balance. Honor, compassion, right? So honor is kavod. Thank you, Haley and Jito. Compassion, rachamim, of course. There was empathy, which is not a traditional Hebrew concept verbatim, the way we now use empathy, and yet all of Torah, if practiced right, is to actually bring us toward a greater sense of empathy. Beautiful. Active decision to support the public good. That key of active and decision, to just remember how much is conscious, even when we take for granted that we already know what we're going to do because we live in a certain stratum of society and we have our practices and our habits and our commutes. But if we can make an active decision to support the public good, that's going to help bring our actions in line with what we know to be true. Enthusiasm, zirizut, right, to offset the despair, the yeush, right on, and equanimity, menuchat hanefesh, to stay even keeled as we follow these pursuits. This is a beautiful, beautiful list, and some, but not all of them, already have slides, and all of them deserve. And so thank you, because this all goes into the hopper. And you may find your favorite attribute coming to version 2.0 of this sometime soon. So before I return to the prepared pieces, any other midot or any questions or thoughts at this juncture? Right. Honored to be.
Actually, I have a real quick comment. But I guess just because of where I sit and things I get involved with and things I look at, what comes up for me is, and that's reflected in my statement, is, climate change to me is also about environmental justice, and it's so intertwined with that sense of community, and I look at it as a system of just but connected parts, and I don't know how that really relates to Mussar, but I think that having different perspectives represented is really important, and listening to different voices. So I don't know how we, whatever, drill down to that, but I'm interested in understanding that relationship.
Amen, and thank you. And that is front and center. Earlier today, the JCRC of Greater Washington had a wonderful webinar with Rabbi Daniel Swartz. Some of you know I'm the chair of this national group, COJOL, Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life. He's the professional and one of my teachers and friends and colleagues. He was actually part of a small group that included Pope Francis drafting a global statement that made some waves a few months ago. That was kind of the entree of this, along with Joel Novi, who is very Adat Shalom adjacent and the head of our local Interfaith Power and Light that I'm the former chair. And Daniel, interestingly, when he lived here, was the very first staff person for our little chapter in its year one back in 05 or 06. Anyway, wonderful webinar, and it absolutely centered environmental justice, because you cannot do this work alone. You cannot do this work with racial and class blinders on, both because of who is most impacted and also because of what it will take to get to successful strategies. So keep that in mind. If it's insufficiently in these slides, call me on it, but that is absolutely central. So tzedek, justice, as an overarching theme that then needs to apply to keep justice in mind when we're thinking in kavod, honor, keep justice in mind when we're thinking in chesed, love, right, etc. So thank you, really appreciate that. Okay. All right, here we go. So, sorry, we were at Zoom. There we go. All right, so these are the baker's dozen from just before the War of 1812, right? After Menachem Mendel of Satanov had read Benjamin Franklin, and he came up with this list. He adds 5 more, and it's interesting, 11 of these 13 are straight from Franklin, which is why, you know, you may not think of these as the top 13 Torah approaches, but they are, 11 of them are straight from Franklin. At the end, Menachem Mendel adds 5 more for our consideration, including the other 2, so that he gets all of Franklin's 13 plus 5 more that he thought were very Torah-centric. So these are not meant to be the right ones for all time. They're socially situated from Philadelphia in the 1750s and then Central Europe in the early 1800s, but they're still a great starting place for us. And we're going to see a bunch of these. We could, I'm not going to focus on cleanliness, nikiut, but if we think of, you know, do not litter amplified into a global principle that is kind of a first do no harm principle, right? Then even cleanliness applies. Separation, perishut, which is really sort of pre-Victorian sexual mores in its original context, right? Is what would it be to strengthen yourself, not just so you can stop lewd thoughts, but so that you can actually stay separate from everything that is destructive, and kind of be that austere in our living, you know, the life of appropriate scale and impact. A reminder, of course, that those 13 are not magic. This is a community that created its own modern ones with an equal number of men and women, and doing a feminist analysis and coming up with some absolutely wonderful modern ones that very much apply. So some completely new ones like Tuv Lev, right? Like how kind was I, or Maaseh, what about taking actual action, as some of you put in the chat. Yetzirut, creativity as an attribute, beautiful, right? But also redefining, like Zirizut as using my time, which is a really good question in this present context. So a reminder that we can do that. Basically, I'm going to walk us quickly through a number of midot in sort of superficial, and then take a slightly deeper dive into 3. And that's our evening together. And then a little bit about hope at the end, along with any questions or feedback you all have. So emet, for starters, doesn't need a whole lot, but emet is, of course, the opening, middle, and closing letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It is literally the alpha and the omega, right? The aleph and the taf with the mem in the middle. And lots else. M is mother and met is death. So we've got this whole thing about flesh and embodiment and life cycle, and right, like there's so much about this one word that is so rich. But to state the obvious in our current moment, truth is there, but it often feels like it's well covered and we have to dig hard to uncover it. And that's the logic behind an inconvenient truth. And whatever you think of this particular pedagogy that Al Gore brought into the field, the title says so much. And that, right, Mussar is about being willing to embrace that which is inconvenient, because there is a greater call. And that call is Torah. That call is ethics. That call is conscience, all of the above. And a reminder, of course, that science is kind of the ultimate truth, to the extent that there is such a thing as objectivity. But of course, science is nothing but a stringing together of a bunch of hypotheses. So within the scientific method is already an approach for deepening truth and holding truth lightly within a sort of margin of error, right? we are plus or minus 3% confident that the world is the universe is 13.8 billion years old, right? We are 99.7% confident that the current Pfizer or Moderna regimen will actually lead to a massive saving of lives, right? We are 99.9% certain that anthropogenic greenhouse gases are posing a very real threat to our collective future. This is science. And if those numbers change, if the upshot changes, if every IPCC report sounds a little bit different, usually a little more dire than the one before it, as scientists begin to realize there's no time to lose in bringing that science into the public square, right? Then when science changes its, quote, opinion, it's not that it was wrong before, it didn't lie, it just learned more. We learned more. And even we non-scientists, and I say that to all but 3 or 4 of us, but there are some scientists on this phone call who could say a lot more about this, that we need to also get to the emet as much as possible. So
that science change, that science not lying but changing, is what we now call a Fauciism.
nice. Exactly. He didn't invent it, but he has popularized it in our time. Right on. Okay. Chesed, loving kindness. Can't go wrong with that. So many of you know the great line from Psalms. Olam chesed yibaneh, yalalai lalai, yalalai. Olam chesed yibaneh, yalalai lalai, yalalai. Right, that the world is built or must be built on chesed, on divine love. And Rav Volbe, who died in 1995, one of the great Mussar masters of the past generation, comments on chesed that it automatically, even though we think of chesed as universal to anyone, love is love, and our love doesn't change based on who is receiving it, and mostly the love goes to those who are proximate to us. But even love already has an activist connotation, that an act of chesed, even small, actually builds, actually creates, actually enlivens the spirit of the downtrodden and the brokenhearted. Again, bringing that kind of environmental justice analysis even to the realm of chesed. We need to have extra love, extra loving kindness for the downtrodden, for the brokenhearted. And so we are creating this as a human family. That's Rabbi Amy Eilberg droshing on Volbe, droshing on Olam Chesed. How does this play out then, of course? By marching on the Capitol with our friends from the American Friends Service Committee. I love their sign at every, right? Just like our Reformed Jewish friends have the do justice, love mercy, march proudly. That's their sign for all these rallies, right? And this one, simply quoting our own scripture, love thy neighbor, and reminding us of making explicit what's implicit, no exceptions. And in a global village, no exceptions, that takes some work. That necessarily centers the downtrodden, the brokenhearted, the marginalized, the historically disenfranchised, and anyone whose voices are not at the same level of audibility because of structural injustices that need to be rectified. So love thy neighbor and Black Lives Matter absolutely go together. And in particular, as we look around the world and think who is most affected by these challenges, it tends to be those who A, did the least to cause the mess we're in by emitting less, and B, who have the least to adapt to the coming catastrophes. And so with Frontline, with BIPOC, with Global South friends, we need to remember that this is connected to bearing the burden of the other, that this is chesed put in practice in an unequal world, in an unequal, rapidly warming world, to remember who is most affected and who most needs our chesed. At the other end of the spectrum, right, there are many people who practice frugality or kimutz or histapkut, simplicity, out of necessity because they simply don't have. And people who barely have access to electricity or running water, I think we can all agree that we should actually emit a little more so that they can have some, but yet the total needs to come down, and that means the rest of us need to live way more simply than our current lifestyles, our current, I love the visual here of like, this is what we have done to God's creation. We have taken every square inch and made it ours and crowded everything else out in the process. And our current lifestyle choices generally flow from the very design of our neighborhoods. And so we need to think about what is often called voluntary simplicity, or in Jewish law, the law of Bal Tashchit, not wasting. That is actually in halacha. And there's some great resources out there. We're not going to delve, but keep frugality and voluntary simplicity, histapkut, in mind. Hoda'ah, channeling that attitude of gratitude, also known as hakarat hatov, calling out or lifting up that which is good. This is partly the reminder, right? And Rabbi Andrea London says it so beautifully, focusing more on what we have than on what we lack. And this practice can shift our perspective from lack to abundance. And my friends at Dayenu, which just came on the scene in the last 2 or 3 years, chose Dayenu as the name for the new big Jewish climate activist organization because of 3 sort of Dayenus out there. One is that we do have enough. We need to practice that attitude of gratitude and be happy with what we have. Also, we've had enough, like we need to change it already. And we are enough, that we are the right people to do it. So Dayenu cubed is a good thing to remember, but in its most basic sense of Dayenu, we've got it. This is enough. We should be happy with what we have. At the center of traditional Mussar is Yirat Shamayim, right? Fear or awe of heaven. And it's all about developing that. That's in many ways the starting point for traditional Mussar. And while that is a very theologically laden midah, we need to remember how activist it is in orientation. The very first recorded act of civil disobedience in global history was the midwives. And Moses, and therefore us, are here to tell the story only because of some awesome uppity women who defied an evil order and, sort of practiced resistance against empire and stood for the downtrodden. And they practiced chesed, loving kindness, and tzedek, justice. And what does the Torah tell us about these midwives who are presumed not to be Jewish? There's some midrash that makes them into Jews, but the context is they're probably not, right? Vatire'ena, they were yar'eh. These women were yar'eh. They had fear, awe of God, and therefore they did this. They extended themselves. They took risks. They practiced human and moral solidarity with their sisters because of this yirah. That's some good stuff. Amy Eilberg again droshing that. So to introduce the next two, this is a throwback to the concepts, but there's this notion straight from Rav Salanter himself, every midah and its opposite, kol midah v'hipucho, which is, again, this idea of balance. So even if it's 99-1, humility is a really good thing, but we occasionally need a little hubris to speak up when we need to speak up, right? Too much humility is bad, even though not enough humility tends to be worse. Every midah can be along that kind of spectrum, which ultimately is its own midah of izun, or balance, as we see on the bottom. So to put two into play against each other, both of which are eco-midot in their own way, savlanut, we take the long view. Savlanut, literally patience, related to the word for suffering. We have to suffer at how slow it's going. We have to suffer at the level of tolerance that we're giving to other approaches, because it's also related to sovel, to bear, like a porter is a sablan, porter at the hotel, right? The one who bears the load. So it's closely connected to bearing the burden of the other. Here it's bearing the burden of time and bearing the burden of maybe this isn't quite right. But on the one hand, we need to take the long view. I like numbers. So in the context of long view, 1, 7, and 50. That's a question. A riddle. Anyone who's got it, unmute.
One I'm confused by. I mean, I know that I know that 50 would be the Jubilee year, and then 7 would be, Shemitah, but I'm not quite sure which meant 1, unless it's like.
Yeah, well, 1 established.
Just life cycle, or
right.
we have agricultural years and lots of recognition on that. So
Exactly.
I'm not sure.
So 1 is a year, and in a year there are 4 seasons, unless you're really equatorial. And in a year there's ups and downs, and it is its own cycle. And some years on average are better than others. And the last 2 we're not going to talk about. For some of us, the last 5.5 we're not going to talk about. But we take the long view. We think in sacred sevens, and that is, of course, Shemitah, where not only do we therefore even out, right? Just like, think about the COVID charts, right? Yesterday's number of new infections is less important than the 7-day average, right? So 7 already has that kind of notion as smoothing out to look at bigger picture patterns rather than the noise of daily life. Shemitah allows that in years, just as Sabbath allows that in days. That's what Zev Unger, our 13-year-old B mitzvah, taught on Saturday so beautifully. And then, of course, 7 times 7 plus 1, at the end of 7 cycles of that meta cycle, we get an even bigger cycle, which is only once or twice in a lifetime, of Yovel, of an even more radical release. And only the 50, only the Yovel begins to approach generational terms. But then our numbers go even bigger. Right? And each of these you have to multiply by 25 or 30 for the average years of a door, of a generation. But in those 13 attributes, we learn that God is focused on the 3rd and 4th generation, and even on the 1000th generation, Notzer chesed la'alafim, right? Extending kindness to the thousandth. That's amazing. That is geological time. That is theological time. Aldo Leopold in 1949, Sand County Almanac, amazing eco primer for the American environmental literature experience. One of his beautiful sections in toward a land ethic section is called Thinking Like a Mountain. And you have to think not just about you as the hunter or the hiker on the mountain, you have to think like the mountain. And that's geological time, which again is close to theological time. And you hear shades there also of seventh generation from the Iroquois Confederacy and from native teachings, which are so resonant here as well. And so we're all in this one together, and the wisest of traditions always point us in these intergenerational directions, whereas the modern model has literally a future discount rate that is currently only 3-point-something%. Right? I mean, it's crazy, but the amount by which we allow to say in the unknown future, it's less important. And therefore, in a cost-benefit analysis, like how many lives will be saved by tightening the regulation on methane or mercury, that number that is arcane as hell is a life and death number, because it says how much we care about future generations relative to ourselves. And we need voices like Iroquois and like Jewish in the public sphere to make sure that we are not over discounting our progeny. So that's again savlanut, which is patience, but of course patience while, fiddle while the world burns, right? So against that is zirizut, or zeal, right? And we need a certain amount of each of them, arguably even more zirizut, even though we have to take the long view, right? Because unfortunately, it is only a fairy tale in which a change of government and climate change just goes away. Love that graphic. And of course, channeling Dr. King and the fierce urgency of now, again, bringing in an environmental justice angle to remember that the struggles of civil rights, the struggles of empowerment of dispossessed or underprivileged sectors of humanity directly overlaps with this enfranchisement of all species and of all generations. So there's a lot here on zirizut, and in the interest of time, not going to focus so much, but it's that there's a lot there. And let's channel some zeal, bring some zirizut. And then the three that I wanted to spend a little more time on, though it's already getting late, if I had to pick a big three, these are mine: achrayut, anava, and kavod. Responsibility, humility, and honor. So we're going to go very, very quickly, leave some time for discussion, and maybe an ending about hope. One of my friends, Ed Dayenu, amazing rabbi, sent me this cartoon because we have this running friendly debate over what's the relative importance of individual green actions and living a green lifestyle to reinforce the work we do, or how much we should be almost exclusively focused in the public sphere. And the generation thing is so apt, right? In the 80s, pick up your litter and save the earth. By the 90s, it had to be a little more intensive. You got to now recycle, and then you'll save the earth. And then it was shrink your carbon footprint. But now we get just how much time has gone by and how dire it is. Completely restructure global economic systems, and you may be able to save a remnant of humanity. It's wry humor, it's dark humor, it's also painfully true. So achrayut is responsibility. What does it mean to start by simply picking up your litter and then recycling and then reducing and reusing and lowering your carbon footprint, and then getting involved in complete restructuring once you realize just how urgent this is. We are all in this together. Famous midrash, the image of spaceship Earth, Adlai Stevenson and others, comes straight from this, that we're like a boat, right, out there in the vast ocean of space. And Shimon Bar Yochai, the great mystic 2nd century Rav, taught this parable that people are sitting on a ship and one takes a drill and says, I paid for passage. I bought this seat. I can do what I want, because that's how private property works. Takes a drill, starts to drill under their seat on the boat, right? And of course, the rest is obvious. But that if we over-focus on what is ours, if we over-focus on private property and private gain and private benefit at the expense of the common good, we will all drown. And that is precisely the point of Spaceship Earth, and that is precisely the point of achrayut, responsibility. When we realize that we are each 1/8 billionth, although actually by amassed wealth and carbon footprint, most of us are an order of magnitude higher than that, right? But we are our own fraction of this, of the people who are collectively captaining Spaceship Earth's future, and we need to do everything we can, and we need to educate others and create incentives for them to do everything they can in order to make sure that we don't drown. It's almost that simple. And Alan Marinus, again, of the Mussar Institute, says it so well. He says that Mussar is taking responsibility, achrayut. If you made that mess, clean it up. Better still, foresee the mess and take responsibility before it happens, so there won't even be a mess. That applies in interpersonal dialogue. In classic, this is tshuva, this is cheshbon hanefesh, right? We do the Yom Kippur thing so that we get better at it, so that next time I won't be as insulting, I won't be as haughty, I won't, right, etc. Before it even happens. But it also applies directly to the visible mess of, like, PM 2.5 and NOx and SOx of our emissions, to use the environmental jargon, but it also applies to the invisible, to the CO2 and the methane. And what would it look like to take responsibility before it happens, so there won't even be a mess? We are responsible, right? And as Simcha Zissel Ziv of Kelm, the altar of Kelm, one of Salanter's disciples, famously taught, bearing the burden of the other, rooted in this original notion of the material needs of another, are my spiritual needs, an obligation of my spiritual life. This is core Mussar, and we need to apply that in particular to climate refugees, victims of rising seas, those suffering most from droughts and wildfires, etc. And that, of course, is those who have the least ability to adapt. Again, BIPOC, Global South. All of this is directly connected to achrayut. And this is how I've taught it before. It points to some beautiful Torah from Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, who basically said that there's 3 things ahead of us. There's mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. The more quickly we mitigate, meaning emit less, the less adaptation we'll need to do and the less suffering there will be. The more we adapt, because we can't mitigate fast enough, the less suffering there will be. But there's already enough climate impact out there and locked in that we've already locked in massive amounts of suffering. But mitigation best, adaptation next best, minimize the suffering, not eliminate it. It's too late for that. That is achrayut. And that is the reminder that as small as our individual choices are, my next meal, whether it's going to be hamburger or tofu, my next commute, whether it's going to be in an inefficient vehicle, an efficient vehicle, or mass transit, or foot power, right? Those decisions add up. And any one of them on its own is pretty close to infinitesimally small. But enough of those together actually add up. And that is achrayut. So putting ourselves in right context is anava, humility, which is literally in Mussar terms, taking up the right amount of space. This is very much a gendered thing, because based on how common Western socialization goes, men tend to take up that space in a way that women often don't. And so the classic view of anava is in many ways more the male, the androcentric approach, which is take up less space. When in fact, part of it is take up less space if you're someone who already takes up your share or more, so that others can rise and take up their right amount of space. So it's kind of the achrayut of anava, the responsibility of humility to make sure that all God's critters got a voice in the choir. And that is work for all of us. And that falls along gender lines, but also along race lines and national, etc. And we need to be conscious of that. It also applies as a species. So these next few slides are alarming, but I think really important. Where I say in the bottom, see global biomass. Remember that the key Mussar definition of anava is take up the right amount of space. How are we, Homo sapiens, as one species among millions, how are we doing on spaceship Earth at taking up the right amount of space? Gewalt. This was a study by two people at the Technion, I believe, along with one in California from 2018. The impact of humanity on the biosphere. Today, I'm just going right to the middle, the biomass of humans and the biomass of livestock far surpass that of all wild mammals. Ditto, domesticated poultry biomass greater by a factor of 3 than all wild birds combined. Here's the alarming graph. So look on the bottom, wild mammals of the biomass of all mammals. We are talking from elephants and blue whales all the way down to the countless moles and voles and mice and rats, all of their biomass added up, all the too many deer in Rock Creek Park, all of, right, all the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, 4% of the biomass of mammals today. The vast majority is livestock. And the next far biggest runner-up is humans alone. The biomass of 7.9 billion humans is vastly greater. We have outsized all the rest of mammalian life by a mind-boggling factor. Tzimtzum is the classic from Isaac Luria's Kabbalah of the 1570s, from Tzfat, right? The idea that God initially self-contracted, created a space in the middle of universal God where there was no God or was less God. And basically, in the name of relationship, self-contracted. Beautiful metaphor. We all need to be a little bit less all about ourselves in order for relationship to flourish. And God taught that at the very beginning. This self-contraction is tzimtzum. and it is a spiritual practice worth all of us emulating. So if anyone follows the Forwards pop culture, they've just put out a list of 150 greatest Jewish pop songs of all time. And number 110 is droning doom metal from Philadelphia. It's Dan Blacksburg's group, Devacus. And the song is called Contraction of Infinite Light, right? Which is the Tzimtzum story. It's Isaac Luria's Kabbalah made pop music. It's edgy and fun and 9 minutes, and go look it up. Happy to send the slides. The YouTube is there. But this idea of taking up less space in the name of relationship, really at the center. Anava, straight from Shemitah and Yovel, from Leviticus 25, the same chapter that has the Liberty Bell inscription on it. V'ha'aretz lo timaker litzmitut. You must never do anything to the land beyond reclaim. Ki li ha'aretz, because the land is mine, says God. Gerim v'toshavim atem imadi. By me, next to me, you are simply green card holders. You are not full owners here. You're allowed to be here as long as you obey the rules. But you are strangers. You are sojourners. You are temporary. Me and the land are what's permanent. And that, not surprisingly, is at the heart of what our radical Catholic friends in Central and South America came up with as liberation theology. Their leading verse is also ours. Ladonai ha'aretzum loa tevel veyoshveva. Right? The earth is God's and the fullness thereof, from Psalm 24. Also, del Señor es la tierra. This is core Torah, as it applies to humanity and as it applies to all species. It relates also to avoiding eco-hubris, because this is just a PS in the green applicability of humility, but it's very easy for green activists to sort of play the one-upsman game of like, look how many times I biked to work this week, right? Look how I went from lacto-ovo to vegan, right? And yes, those things are all helpful. And yet we need to avoid all kinds of hubris. And that's the reminder that what sets Mussar apart is it's all about pursuing the holiness. Self-improvement is the path. It is not the end goal. And I love how Rabbi Nosson Tzvi Finkel learned from the same source as Michelle Obama's mother, right? Don't be better, be higher. Love that. As we get better at our environmental practice, as we get better at bearing the burden of the other by emitting less, don't be better, be higher. Anava, of course, also relates in intercultural and interreligious terms. No one of us has all the truth. No one faith has all the truth. So pluralism. And all of the teachings of coexistence apply here as well. And Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer has actually brought that in, where she was the leader at RRC of implementing study of Christianity and world religions. Ours was the first movement to require rabbis to be educated in other religions, because that's kind of what it means to be a public religious leader, right? Like, we need to be trained for the interfaith encounter and for the work together. And she has applied Mussar to that, and she sort of teaches Mussar as virtues in her Sisterhood of Shalom Salam and other interfaith encounters. And I love what she writes here, that as my Jewish formation grew more solid, my interfaith work evolved. Sharing spiritual practices for the cultivation of character, i.e. Mussar, enhanced encounters across faith for me, even as they further strengthened my own grounding as a Jew. We can sink deeper roots as we open wider hearts. Love that. And in the home stretch, kavod, honor. Again, Rabbi David Jaffe, this wonderful book, and we're all learning from the same sources like Ben Zoma back in Mishnah Avot, Ezehu mechubad, who is the one who is honored? It's only ha-mechabed et habriot, the person who honors, actively confers honor on the creations, usually translated as on all people, but bria is from the word creation. So it is quite literally, the one who is honored is the one who honors all the creations. Beautiful little eco teaching buried in Ben Zoma's often mistranslated little aphorism there. And as David summarizes, to give kavod is essential, whereas to seek kavod, to build yourself up in this hubristic way, is of course destructive to the individual and the community. And at the same time, developing our own inner kavod, honor for ourselves and our needs and our boundaries and our abilities, is the foundation of sustainable social change. So kavod in every way is something we got to grapple with in this field. Rav Volbe again reminds us, as some of you have heard me teach over the years, the root is heavy. It's even the same word as liver, right? Which is the heaviest organ, right? The liver is that which filters out the impurities. And in the social sphere, kavod, when practiced proactively, can do exactly the same. If we apply honor equally to everyone, maybe disproportionately to those who wouldn't otherwise receive the honor if we don't shine the light there, proactive kavod, that is how we can remove the impurities from the social realm. Yet again, the environmental justice angle. And it's ultimately about honoring the heaviness, the significance, the substance of everyone, because it's heavy. The opposite, light, kal, is in klala. It is a curse to treat someone as if they are lightweight. It is heavily holy to treat someone with the weight that they deserve. And so kavod automatically needs to be in the same dialogue with questions of structural racism, with our own implicit and internal biases, with that focus on BIPOC and the global South. The exact people who don't receive the kavod the way the current system is structured, then we got to change the system. And it starts with our own individual practices, but this is where the teaching of anti-racism comes in. It's not enough to simply try to be colorblind, right? We need to actively change, improve, even dismantle and reconstruct the systems that are doling out kavod in a most unholy way. This is how anti-racist work is holy work. This is how anti-racist work is Jewish work. And David Jaffe, the Orthodox Rabbi Mussar teacher, together with Yehuda Webster and others, is currently in the middle of teaching a whole beautiful unit on Mussar and racial justice. And a number of us are learning that and look forward to teaching that and sharing that. And it very much overlaps with this Torah. All right. That's a lot of midot. And that's a lot of teaching. And there's some good stuff about hope that maybe we can end with, but at least you saw the word. Any thoughts, arguments, deepenings? Bring it on.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Hey, Jito.
Hi, everyone. So I just have a thought and say thank you for the time and experience of a lot of learning. And I just want to connect something based on the day. Today is the first day of African American History Month, and it's kind of being very tough situations because I have an Eastern American class, and my professor just said most of the states they're banning this class to teach the people how things were. And today they're banning African American history, and I believe it's true that one day they will be banning Jewish history too as well. They will ban almost of the history because of one thing that they just don't want to change it. And the way they approach things is the disrespect of the earth and what God says that everybody here, we just passing by. This belongs to Him. Everyone is trying to, the way you explain, you sit in a boat and you, a private property, you just doing what you do on your own. You don't see how much it affects people's life. So I guess we need more a little bit of humanity and empathy. And last night we just saw this uh, Twitter things that somebody said that Jewish Holocaust wasn't about race; it was about humanity, and she was judged. And I could see that we're very willing to judge each other instead of trying to understand what is the base that a person brings, and we living in fight even inside our communities. So I made the same question, showing the article to a Jewish person and showing the video, a Jewish person. The person who saw the video say, oh, wow, she did a good approach about this because this is the deepest thought about racism and hate. It's about inhumanity, because if you say another human being is not a human at all, this is not fair at all. We're all the same. So in this month, based on those two stories, based on everything that's happening around the world because of this fight between NATO's, Russia, everywhere, this is all about selfness. Like people don't care about each other. And we need to start looking to each other and ask ourselves before attacking, because this is most important things in our life. We don't take these 5 seconds to think like, okay, I'm attacking him. Can I give him a second chance to come again with his thoughts? So it's just a small approach I want to include on your speech and this month as well.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, the fact that this is Black History Month is, definitely a piece of it, and it's very hard to teach Black history in the current backlash environment. It's critical race theory is first of all not even historical. It's a legal set of principles, but more importantly, it is emet. It is simply truth. The aleph, the mem, the taf, the beginning, the middle, the end. Right? If it's true, it needs to be part of the picture. And Mussar is exactly the part of Judaism that teaches us to focus, despite the discomfort, on the imperfections, to focus on the inconvenient truths. The 1619 Project is Mussar applied to American history. Critical race theory is Mussar applied to the legal profession. And yes, thank you, amen, right? And that's exactly the point, is the same bugaboos that lead us defensively. Not necessarily all of us individually, but we can see the tendency that even maybe our friends across the aisle, depending on which side of the aisle we're on, right, are turning into legislation. We can understand the tendency to downplay our own culpability, or the culpability of the people like us or of our ancestors. And that leads to, quite literally, the whitewashing of history. If it leads to the whitewashing of carbon footprint, then we are actually consigning more and more people in the global South to horrible, horrible futures. But that same whitewashing of these equations is also consigning our own grandchildren to those same horrible futures. This is enlightened self-interest, ultimately, to stand up against this current backlash and to embrace a Mussardic approach to education and to life, as which will, I believe, necessarily lead us to anti-racist commitments and will also necessarily lead us to low carbon commitments. And those two overlap tremendously. So thank you so much, Jito, for raising that. That's maybe the single greatest contribution Moosar can make in this moment. Carol. We lost your video, but you raised your hand.
Oh,
Yeah. It's okay.
there. So yes and yes and yes, but how do you think about Moosar when you're confronted with, I mean, we're all preaching to the choir, and when you are not, when you have all those other people who aren't part of our choir, who refuse to ever consider getting a vaccination, who refuse to ever think about that, you know, CRT is ruining our children and these books are, what do we do with all that? I mean, I find that all overwhelming.
Yeah. I'm going to crowdsource that one. Anyone have great insight?
Well, you know, because I've got plenty of conservative relatives and a few conservative friends, I can't respond to everything that they say that irritates me. I try to keep channels of communications open so we can build trust, and there are certain areas where we can talk about things. And I just pick and choose battles, honestly, and maybe some people would consider that a wimp's reaction, but you know, you cannot respond to everything. I mean, I can't take, you know, I'm not going to bear that mantle if there's something really offensive. I can say something, but if you don't have the trust and mutual respect, and I'm talking about people I've had a relationship with for 40 or 50 years, so, you know, my inclination is not to just cut them off. Other people react differently, and I think it really depends on what you can tolerate. I have, you know, I think about this a lot, and partly I like to give to organizations like ProPublica, people that are interested in supporting investigative journalism, making sure that actual factual information, as we know it, is coming to the fore, and information is presented in a way that people, or large swaths of people, can consider objective, because the way we receive information, not just media, but from advocacy organizations. I mean, I know enough things I know enough about to see that even if I'm largely in support, the mission of some advocacy organizations, the way they present themselves is distorted. And so it gives you that, you know, it forces me to like distrust people that I might otherwise support. So I think, how do we improve the quality of information that people digest and are that they have access to? To me, is I don't have the answer, but it is something I think is part of the equation. Because people often want simple answers, and we're talking about very complex systems with all kinds of interactions, and so there are no simple answers. There are different strategies, or a combination of strategies. Anyhow, that's something that goes through my head.
Yeah, thank you. Ultimately, tradition tells us we have to change ourselves in order to change the world. And we start with those around us. So if we get better at our own carbon footprint, and if we clarify our priorities enough that we do even more in the next cycle to educate or to activate or to canvass or to donate or whatever it is, right? And if enough of us are on that journey together of both the self-betterment and the collective, over time, that makes a difference. The famous Margaret Mead quote, right? About you know, a small group of concerned citizens is the only thing that's ever changed history. How do we develop? How do we become those activated, concerned citizens? Well, Moosar, right? As Jews, right? That can get us there. it will also, I believe, make us nicer people. And I think the people around us who share homes with us or workplaces are, will benefit. But again, ultimately, the traditional goal is simply to be holy. And just like Leviticus 19 with love your neighbor as yourself and don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, it opens Kedoshim Tihiyu, you shall be holy. And then laws about worker protection and sustainable agriculture and activism, not standing by the blood of your neighbor, follow. And the heading is, you shall be holy, Kedoshim Tihiyu. So that is Moosar in a nutshell, right there in the middle of Leviticus. Conveniently, it is 8:51 and my battery is going to run out in a couple of minutes. So it is basically time to wrap up. Ralph, you haven't spoken yet. Real quick, please.
In response to what issue Carol was raising, I think it's an opportunity for some humility to kind of say, how do those people get there? What anxiety, what issues are they dealing with? And sometimes it shows almost a certain privilege that we might have in reaching our opinions. And we have to be open to people have other problems that they're dealing with. And sometimes it's only by those politics being open to them that we understand that.
Nice. Again, the dance, savlanut, and patience, right, from to suffer, and even anava, humility, both imply that we can't go in believing that our political values fully formed are absolute truth either. And nonetheless, if ours are also those more informed by science and those more informed by what we understand as Torah ethics, we have to simultaneously hold with humility, but hold strong. And that is the balancing act of a well-lived life that we are all working on. And Moosar hopefully will help. I thank you all. This is rich. I look forward to many more opportunities to explore this stuff with you. I'm available one-on-one for it, and we'll have group opportunities. There's always more from the Adat Shalom Climate Action Team and the Green Tikkun Committee, as well as groups like Dayenu and Chazon out there, Interfaith Power and Light. I realized I was quite literally wearing the kippah today. And more Moosar coming too, from Martha Hare and myself and Rabbi Rachel and many, many others over the coming months and years.
Are the slides available, Fred? Are they going to be the slides, the presentation, are they downloadable or available from?
They are emailable. Email me, rabbifred@adatshalom.net.
Thank you.
And I will share. Maybe eventually we can post to the website too.
Okay.
Great. Awesome. All right. So I'm going to dismiss you if you need dismissing, and anyone who stays may get cut off if my computer dies. But Shelley, I saw your hand. Yeah. Thank you all. Laila Tov.
And I was wondering, what are the midot to look at for encouraging hope, encouraging optimism at this really dark time? Which ones help the struggle?
You are so right. I mean, the number one is Hakarat Tov, or Hoda'ah, lifting up the good and channeling the attitude of gratitude, right? Seeing the glasses half full instead of half empty is ultimately, like, it's the same set of facts, but the orientation is different. And the facts look better if you can emphasize the good. And that goes with teachings of tzedakah. Like Maimonides says, if you have 100 zuzim to give, better to give 1 zuz to each of 100 worthy recipients rather than one big check all at once, right? Because you're then strengthening your muscle of generosity, right? And so the focusing on the good hopefully boomerangs and creates more good out there. The section on hope, if another time I'll happily share, it's not so much midot. There's a debate in the Moosar, is tikva, hope, even a midah of its own or not? Right? Does it count as a midah? And in some systems, yes, it's not on Salanter or Menachem Mendel's original lists, but it certainly can apply as an orientation, call that a midah. But I sort of go into where do I find eco-hope, right? And that is Greta Thunberg, and that is studying cognitive dissonance. That is looking at what Yale and George Mason and others are doing in the climate communications field and figuring out how to most sophisticatedly impart these truths, right? I find hope in all of that and more, personally. Cultivating that may be a Mossardic thing to do, but most of the Midot are not directly hope focused, but a practice of the Midot is ultimately the most hopeful thing that we can bring.
Thank you.
Thank you. Might be a good note to end on.